I'm going to talk about urban crime trends, and criminological theory. I wanted to thank several people. I probably can do this better in writing. I'm hoping that this will end up in a publication. But I wanted to thank in particular Professor Ray Teskey, who's just been invaluable in providing me with access to some of the data that I'm using in this paper. And I was just amazed that he could find it in his files as late as yesterday. I also want to thank a number of other people, but especially Ruth Triplett. Professor Triplett was kind enough to help me get oriented to the computer system here. When others would make remarks like, "Oh, it's easy," she would say, "Well, try this." So I also am going to do something a little different, not different, but something that I asked my graduate students in 786, many of whom are here, not to do. That is, I asked them not to read the paper. It's deadly dull to read your paper. But I'm going to start out reading and probably end up reading, and in between present a kind of slideshow. And the reason I'm doing this is because of the nature of the material, and I want to be very careful. When we get into a question and answer period and turn the camera off, maybe we can be less cautious. But let me start by getting your attention, I hope. Mike Royko, columnist for the Chicago Tribune, wrote in March about President Bush's call for a win in the war on crime. Royko reported that the president said we must show the same moral force, determination, and fortitude as we did in freeing Kuwait to free our cities from crime. Mr. Royko had some fun with George Bush's suggestion that we need a real death penalty, pointing out that the people killed, that he assumed that the people killed were really dead, and that if anything, the murder rate has gone up in the states that are killing the most criminals. Royko also suggested that the current lack of prison space might be solved if the president used some moral force, determination, and fortitude to call for higher taxes to pay for new prisons. After discussing some more direct approach to fighting crime using intelligent bombs and intellectual missiles to, quote, take out parts of the Bronx, the west side of Chicago, and other high crime areas, even if there's a little, quote, collateral damage, Mr. Royko came to the issues most relevant for criminologists and criminal justice practitioners, criminological theory. He says, of course, there are those dreamy-eyed types who have theories about crime and its causes. They talk about education, job training, breaking the cycle of poverty, ignorance, unemployment, and busted families. We've always had those kind of silly theorists. Even 100 years ago, when Chicago's highest crime rates could be found in the city's Irish neighborhoods, there were those who made excuses. He then suggests that the country has been fortunate enough to have presidents who didn't buy any of these bleeding heart theories. He says, quote, they know why a criminal is a criminal, because he's a born criminal, that's why. And there's no sense throwing money at born criminals, even if they haven't been born yet. In this short, sardonic piece, Mike Royko underscores the importance of criminological theory. He reminds us of the impact of theory on policy and points out that not all criminological theorists are academicians. Although our politicians are acting on quasi-theory rather than formal attempts to explain crime, their approach is still highly theoretical, still speculative, even when they present it with ideological certainty. I also wanted to mention a thing that just came in yesterday by James Fife, who's had studied justice in the, I guess they just call it Department of Justice. It's wonderful to be Professor of Justice at the American University. I guess the only better title is to be Dean of Justice at American University. But Fife takes on this issue and in the same way points to the importance of theory. He quotes the Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh, who opened his recent crime summit by asking law enforcement officials to leave considerations of the causes of crime to ivory tower types and to attack street crime with the vigor shown by U.S. troops in the Persian Gulf. He says such rhetoric is achingly familiar to most Americans. We've heard it now for at least 15 years, maybe 20. He says, this is Fife, I was a cop for 16 years, and I'd be the last one to say that strategies of deterrence, law enforcement, and incarceration are not necessary. My point, though, is that they are not sufficient. and that without any crime control agenda, and that any crime control agenda that relies on them without isolating and ameliorating the conditions that cause most crime is doomed to failure. And then he has, I think, what's the best point in his article. He says, can anyone imagine the Surgeon General urging doctors to attack AIDS without giving any thought to its causes? Now, what Fife is saying, and what I want to underscore, and I suggested that to the students, that there is a link between theory and the research we do. There's also a link between theory and the policies that people follow and propose. And therefore, there's a very strong link between theory and politics. We act and present ideas that are influenced by our particular politics, by our particular ideology. And I put myself in that. I'm no different in that respect. I want to bring this up early on so that you'll understand that the solution that I come to, and even the kinds of data I look at, are influenced by my particular set of values, by my particular political perspective. Now, if there's still those of you out there who are saying, well, ideology doesn't have anything to do with it, I'm a pure scientist, I am here to suggest that you're deluding yourself. And that if you step back and look self-reflectively at the kind of work you do, the kind of data you collect, the kinds of theories you find attractive, and ask yourself why, at base you'll come down to the set of values. And those of you who say, well, I'm not concerned with values or with theory, I just have some expertise and people pay me for that expertise, and all I need to do is tell them what they need to know, like an engineer or something. I think that even for engineers and for scientists in general, but especially for social scientists and for practitioners and academic practitioners, that position it may not be immoral, but it's certainly not amoral. It reflects a particular value position. The value position says, I'll do anything for money, and don't bother me with the details. So what I'm saying here is that when I get to the end and I put forward the theory I'm attracted to, that I think explains what I see in the data, I don't pretend that this is not influenced by my previous life, by my political orientation, by my ideology. And all I ask you to do is to be self-reflective enough to see that what you don't like about it may be the result of the same basic thing, except that your orientation is different. Now, I also began with this example to point out that discussions of criminological theory need not be dull. To the extent that the theories being discussed today deal with contemporary issues and take into account some inconvenient facts, they will be controversial, perhaps even unsettling. The variation on structural theory I present today is not meant to be controversial, it's meant to be provocative. It is an attempt to make sense of 20 and 30-year trends in urban crime rates and some of the striking aspects of those rates. Retroduction in urban crime trends. Focusing on disaggregated urban crime rates compiled for more than 2 decades for some of the largest cities in the United States is an exercise in what some have called retroduction. Rather than deduce a set of propositions to be tested using a well-articulated formal theory of crime, this approach involves the examination of a sizable body of data in the hope of finding or developing a theory that fits the data. Technically, this is not an inductive approach because we're not trying everything to see what might produce some specific result. It is more accurately described as a search for the kind of theory required to make sense of the data. The data set in this case consists of information on the age, race, and gender of persons arrested in specific cities from 1960 to 1980, and in a few cities to 1989. Over the next few years, with the availability of 1990 census data, it will be possible to extend the analysis through 1990. Although the arrest information is a major component of the study, counts of offenses known to the police for the same cities are also available. In addition, age, race, and gender information is available for the respondents to the 1973 to 89 national crime surveys, and state and federal incarceration data showing the characteristics of inmates is also available. In looking at this data, I'm not searching for a theory that will explain crime in general. I'm involved in a search for an explanation for the increases in predatory crime that have been reported in recent years. I don't believe we're going to find a general theory of crime. Crime is too variable, too influenced by moral and political entrepreneurs to be seen as a unitary phenomenon. So long as there are rules, there will be some level of rule breaking. Another way to say this is to suggest that some level of crime is normal and should be expected. Slogans like, quote, winning the war on crime or, quote, abolishing crime are not so much utopian as they are misleading and cynical. Efforts to reduce specific types of predatory crime make sense, but suggestions that crime in general can be eliminated or explained are misleading. With this as a starting point, the question becomes, what has happened to specific crime rates in specific cities in recent decades, and how can these trends be understood? The broad question I'm interested in is this. Has there been an increase in predatory crime rates from 1960 to the present, and if so, what has produced it? There is evidence that something happened between 1960 and 1980 that probably continued through the 80s. The, quote, liberal crime policies of the 60s did not seem to work. The conservative policies of the 70s and 80s fared no better. There are now clear indications that in the form of homicide and robbery rates, that contemporary policies and procedures for the control of violent crimes are not working either. Some national indicators suggest that there has been an increase in violent offenses that is unparalleled in U.S. history. Published crime rates for most large cities remain high or continue to rise. Arrest rates for those same cities also rise. And incarceration rates for the most populous states in the country are setting records. Now, even if the UCR rates are wrong in some sense, and there has been little or no increase in violent crime rates, it would still be important to understand the increases in arrests and incarcerations that have been reported in recent years. Although many questions can be raised about the offense and arrest data, trends in incarceration rates are striking and probably accurate. As Figure 1 suggests, we have the highest incarceration rate in the history of the country. Let's get the right set here. This doesn't actually show the rate. This shows the count. When the rate was computed for about 1985 or 86, showed about 200 per 100,000 people, and it was indeed the highest rate in the history of the country. So that when 1990 comes, we have good population data and even better population counts of people incarcerated. There's no question that the 1990 rate of incarceration will set new records in a way that's so striking that it surpasses the increases that occurred during the Great Depression and right up till to almost just before the war. This is a phenomenal increase. Now, everybody knows that this is not related to increases in crimes. Even the published crime rates haven't increased in this way. The kinds of things that drive the use of incarceration are not crimes known to the police or arrests. The kinds of things that drive it are politics and the position that and the theory that somehow if we lock enough people up for long enough periods of time, we will reduce the crime rate. Now, the theory hasn't worked well over the last decade, but there are those who want to redouble the effort. This may be good for people in the incarceration business, but it's going to be a futile effort if the point is to reduce the crime rates. As the subtitle to Jim Fife's article is the object to get tough or to get results? I think. Now, in addition to the incarceration rates, there are some other facts we need to consider. Black Americans constitute almost one-half of the prison population. They are greatly overrepresented in relation to their numbers in the U.S. population, where they make up about 12% of the U.S. population. I say that because there are people in the part of the country I come from that think that somehow the country is divided 50-50, black and white, when in fact blacks are only maybe at most 12% of the population, but they account for almost 50% of the people locked up. Since 90 to 95% of those locked up are men, 6 to 8% of the population account for almost 50% of the prison population. That's a startling and should be sobering fact. Nationally, the proportion of people arrested for predatory crimes that are classified as black has increased steadily since 1960. Another point, demographic changes have not been uniformly distributed across all segments of the population, or even across all segments of the urban population. The number of non-white, that is overwhelmingly black, children living in central cities has increased since 1960, while the number of white children in most cities has decreased. Most central cities have also been hit harder than suburban areas by the decrease in manufacturing jobs. In looking at the crime data, we need to remember that national crime trends are greatly influenced by central city trends. In fact, I maybe put it in here as a note if I don't get to say it later. When we look at combining the Dallas and Houston data, you have to realize that the arrests in those two cities account for half the arrests in the whole state. Those two agencies account for half of Texas's arrests. So urban and rural crime rates are quite different. Central city and metropolitan area rates differ sharply. For this reason, the figures and tables presented below begin with national trends, but the national figures are quickly followed by the analysis of central city trends. Figure 2 shows the trends for the United States. Well, actually it doesn't. I was going to put most of these on one, create one chart with 4 pictures on it, but the technology caught up with me. The lack of my own computer technology caught up with me, and so let's get it straight here. So what this is a comparison of U.S. robbery offense and arrest rates per 100,000, and from 1960 to actually 1989. Well, these might be 90. Well, some of this data goes 89, and some of it's 90. But in any case, you can see that there has clearly been an increase in the arrest rate, although it seems to have dipped here. There is certainly an increase in the offense known rate that's been going on over this period of time. Now, let's get this right. If we look at this for Texas, this is a very comparable pattern. There's certainly been an increase in the arrest rate. Why the dip in 85? It's hard to say. Maybe some of you have some explanation for that. Certainly, at best, the arrest rates have remained high if they haven't leveled off, and the offense rates continue to go up. In fact, outstripping the arrest rates. Now, let's go to this one. Just to give you an idea, that Texas is not that different from the rest of the country. This chart puts both of those on the same graph. And while the rates are different, certainly the national rates are much higher. The trends are very much the same for both Texas and the United States in arrest and offenses. Let me catch up with this. These figures show the robbery offense rates you can see the increase from about 50 per 100,000 in 1960 to over 200 per 100,000 population in 1980. Shows an increase in the arrest rate for robbery, and I'm focusing on robbery, from 30 to over 60 per 100,000 over the same period. In rough terms, arrests for robbery doubled from 1960 to 1989, and robbery offenses or attempts coming to the attention of the police increased over 300%. If the UCR information is reasonably accurate, this suggests that nationally the police may be increasingly less able to respond effectively to the number of robberies occurring in the United States. I should point out that when National Crime Survey data present conflicting trends, conflicting with these trends, suggesting that there has been little increase in robberies from 1973 to 1985. However, if robbery victimization has not increased, why have reports to the police, arrests, and incarcerations increased? It's possible, of course, that, as those of you who've worked in police departments, that the figures in many departments are occasionally cooked, and the offense known figures at least, produce results that, say, the mayor wants to see or the city council likes to see. But the arrest data, it seems to me, is quite different because it isn't published nationally by city. It's not readily available to politicians in particular localities. So there'd be little reason for the police to cook the arrest data. And because there's usually bodies involved, I suspect that the arrest data provides a real puzzle if, in fact, there's been no increase in victimization. I want to try something out on you, and I'm anxious for your responses. The responses shouldn't be, oh, you're crazy, or you don't understand statistics, but give me a good explanation for why the victimization survey data over the 10-year period would show no increase, and the arrest and offense data show enormous increases. Now, I'm toying with one possibility. I believe that conflict is essentially a technical problem that might only be resolved by a series of local surveys. One of the disadvantages of the victimization survey, it's only a national figure. You don't get central city estimates. A representative national sample of the population may contain the wrong set of people. It seems unlikely that either victims or offenders are a representative sample of the U.S. population. Official statistics probably reflect the activities and experiences of this unrepresentative sample of the U.S. population. Victimization statistics may represent the experience of a representative sample of the population. The more I thought about that, I thought maybe there's something screwy with that, and maybe several of you can, probably Ray Teskey in particular, can help me out on that. But there is this conflict between the victimization survey data and the UCR data, but it's also conflicts with the incarceration data and with the arrest data. If the differences are not the result of some kind of technical difficulty in data collection procedures, one set or the other is wrong or extremely misleading. When it comes to robbery, the two programs are not really measuring fundamentally different aspects of reality. I mean, some people say, well, victimization measures one thing, UCR measures something else. But if you have robbery victimizations and people report to surveyors that they have been robbed, and the definition of robbery is essentially the same in UCR and in the National Crime Survey, how could we have no increase in victimization and this tremendous increase in offenses known to the police and arrest and incarceration for robbery? Now, the remaining charts in Figure 2, which we've already put up, show the same trends for the state of Texas for a dozen central cities of the U.S. Did I ever get to those central cities? Let's see. Yeah, probably. Including Houston and Dallas. This change in focus is in part a response to changes since 1960 in the number of police agencies reporting both arrest and offense information to the Uniform Crime Reporting Program of the FBI. Let me explain that. I'm switching to look at central cities and combinations of central cities where you have the same agencies reporting for the whole period from the national data, because nationally there has been a change in the number of agencies cooperating with the FBI and providing both arrest and offense data. And the figure for Texas suggests that robbery offenses in Texas increased from 33 per 100,000 to 223 per 100,000 in 1989, a 575% increase. And arrest rates for the same period increased by not as much, but also increased. The city-level trends shown avoid the problems of aggregation that for a state or the country as a whole, and may have influenced the trends in these earlier figures. In addition, the central city arrest data permit a more detailed look at some of the factors influencing the trends observed. Together, these trends suggest that both robbery offenses and robbery arrests have been increasing and continue increasing in the United States. Now, the next set of charts suggests that there are sizable differences in arrest rates for robbery by race. Let me put this one up. Let's see. This is I should probably have marked these better. Let's see. This is black. And this is white. Now, we can see that both. Now, the reason that I've put this on a log scale is because we're interested in relative change for both sets of trends. And if you have very small numbers and another series with very large numbers, you get a distorted picture. But by plotting them on a log scale, you get relative increases. And we can see that the white arrest rates for robbery in 1960 started lower than the black arrest rates for robbery in 1960. This is for the United States. But that by 1989, while there was some decrease in the white robbery arrest rates, There was also a slump here, but then an increase in the black robbery arrest rate, such that the difference between the two, the difference in the two rates, is striking. We'll see this on other charts as well. This is for the state of Texas, and again, you see even in 1960, the difference between the black robbery arrest rate and the black robbery arrest rate and the white robbery arrest rate were considerable. Both increased, though at some point in 1980, the white robbery arrest rate seemed to decline. While there was a dip here, the black robbery arrest rate went up. And it parallels pretty much the U.S. sample, showing tremendous differences between the black and white robbery arrest rates. I should probably have written the numbers in there to give you some indication of what's involved here. But the differences are sizable and striking. Now, I'm going to describe what I've just said there. I want to put some central city data on now. These are for the U.S. and the state of Texas. The central city data. These are robbery arrest rates by race and gender, so that we have a black male robbery arrest rate and a white female robbery arrest rate and everything in between. The central city data reflected in this figure, and the next one I'll show the differences in rates for 4 race and gender groups for a dozen central cities, and for Dallas and Houston combined. They're added into this dozen central cities, but we'll pull them out for special look in the next slide. The Dallas and Houston trends are a little different, but the basic pattern is the same for all the cities in this set. Black men have very high robbery arrest rates in comparison to the other 3 race and gender categories. These rates have been higher for the entire period, but continue to increase in the 80s. And I think the Texas data show that there hadn't been a startling increase here, and a little drop off, but they continue high, and if anything, are quite different from the white male robbery arrest rates. The black female robbery arrest rates went up sharply between, say, 60 and 70, but leveled off and are closer to white male robbery arrest rates than to black male robbery arrest rates. And because this is a log scale, it hardly shows that white women have rates that are so low that they almost fall off the chart, that very few white women, maybe 1 to 10 per 100,000 population, are arrested and charged with robbery. Now, to get some indication of the importance of demographic changes for these trends, I want to put up a table that shows the contribution of changes in age structure in Dallas and Houston in comparison to the contribution of changes in age-specific rates. Let's get rid of some of these things. Don't let your eyes glaze over at all the numbers, as I'm going to point to some of these. But the main point here is that if we took the age groups, 5-year age groups, and took into account the population, we could compute, and then take the reported number of arrests in those age groups, we can then compute a 1960 arrest rate. And if the 1960 arrest rate stayed the same, and only the population changed, then we can compute a 1980 expected arrest rate, but we can also compute the actual 1980 arrest rate. This allows us to say, well, look, if the rate stayed the same, what would we have expected, and how many of these arrests would we have expected, and therefore how much of this increase is due just to demographic changes, that is, to changes in the composition of the population. Now, this was referred 10 or 12 years ago by James Q. Wilson as demographic optimism, and kind of dismissed the suggestion that, well, it only becomes demographic optimism if you suggest that, well, part of the increase, maybe a large part of the increase in arrest is the result of the increase in the numbers of young people. And if we then have a period where there's a decrease in the numbers of young people, we could expect the crime rates to go down. So Wilson was right when he calls this optimism, because it's quite possible that when the youthful population decreases, the average rate per young person in that group will go up, and you won't get any decrease in crime. But what happens here is that for the cities of Dallas and Houston, about 45%, 46% of the increase could be attributed to the fact that you have more young people in these crime-prone groups. So that the group that had the highest robbery arrest rate in 1960 were 15 to 19-year-olds. Now, that group went from 104,000 in these two cities to 217,000 in these two cities. Fortunately, the arrest rate, well, actually it's not fortunate. The 60 rate was 226 per 100,000. The 1980 rate was 293 per 100,000. So this means you double the size of the cohort, size of the number of people in this group, and then you increase their rate. So you get a double whammy in terms of increase in robbery arrest. But what this chart doesn't show is the impact of race and the changing racial composition of these cities. Now, the next figure will try to show that by taking and computing gender, race, and age-specific rates. And in doing this, we start with the black male population, the black female population, the white male population, and the white female population. And we do see tremendous changes in these. So, for example, the 15 to 29-year-old black males increased from 34,000 in 1960 to 120,000 in 1980. Their rate was very high in 1960. The robbery arrest rate for black males was 506. And as I suggested, no, it just doesn't work here. I must have been looking at another table, because the 1980 rate, that did go. I see. I'm losing a line here. Went to 774. So look at the differences in these rates. 774 per 100,000 15 to 19-year-old black males, in comparison to a 15 to 29-year-old white male rate of 171 per thousand. When you compute the ratios of these, they're staggering. Now, so what this shows is what I've suggested, that something happened in this period from 1960 to 80, and one of those things was the urbanization of the black population. In addition to that, the demographics characteristics of the black population is quite different from that of the white population, and therefore, while overall, and it didn't happen for these cities, for Dallas and Houston, the overall population continued to rise, that is, the white population increased as well as the black population in these cities. But for most cities outside of the Southwest, this wasn't the case. In most of these cities, the central cities, the black population increased tremendously, the white population decreased. And to show that, let me put up some cities here. These are 4 eastern cities: Boston, Philadelphia, not New York, because they didn't. New York City didn't report arrest by race until about 1977. But we put into the set Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, and Boston. And we could put into the 4 Midwestern cities Chicago and Detroit, St. Louis. What's another big Midwestern city? Cleveland. Got it. And these are the 4 southwestern or south and western cities, because it includes Phoenix and L.A., but also Houston and Dallas. So the population changes in these southwestern cities is very different from the population change that occurred in the northeast, and in the Midwest. In these cities, when you add them all together, you find this tremendous decrease in the white population, tremendous increase in the black population. Now, combine this in these cities with differences in the robbery arrest rates to start with, and in most cases increases in the robbery arrest rates, and you have some understanding of the robbery rates in our central cities. Now, the problem is, how are we going to explain this? What kind of theory will make sense of this? What kind of theory will explain these increases? And that's the next task I come to. And I've already warned you that this theory I'm attracted to, I won't say I developed because it's been around a while in one form or another, is influenced by my own background in political ideology. In light of these findings, it's reasonable to ask why black arrest and incarceration rates have been so high and why these rates are increasing. Specifically, we need an explanation for the high increasing black robbery arrest rates found in major U.S. cities. This is also true for other crimes of violence, rape and homicide and aggravated assault. I just couldn't get it all into this. I couldn't get all the analysis done. I don't think that individual level explanations will be very useful here. There's little evidence to suggest that young black men are or have become basically different from young white men. You understand, the rates have been going up. So if you go to an individual level explanation, some biological, basic notion of the born criminal or some physiological defect, then you're going to have to suggest that this has been increasing over the last 20 years. And there's nobody looking at the data that suggests that that's the case. My examination of these data and my political ideology suggests to me that the most plausible explanations of these trends are structural, and that these rates are the result of the deteriorating circumstances under which a large number of black people live. If we're going to make sense of these patterns, we're going to have to find a theory that fits the facts as we see them. I think if we do this, we'll need to... I think we will need will be a theory which is essentially a structural explanation. Existing structural explanations have to be modified to explain the peculiar salience of race in these trends. One version of such an explanation was suggested by Robert Sampson in 1987. I'd say suggested or alluded to. He really didn't present it as a theory. It was rather a kind of interpretation of data analysis he'd done. In the discussions that follows, I'm simply extending and revising it and stressing the importance of institutions, that is, entrenched ways of doing things, over an emphasis on individual stress or strain. Sampson focused on changes in both family and economic arrangements. He suggests that the economic position of many adult black men increases rates of crime and delinquency through its impact on family life. Understand that it's not the unemployment, it's the impact the unemployment has on living arrangements, on family life, and on the socialization of children. I think that this is a more fruitful way of looking at unemployment and crime. It gets us away from attempts to find direct links between unemployment and crime and calls attention to the ways in which unemployment and underemployment affect living and marital arrangements. It need not be the psychological strain of unemployment that produces crime. If long-term marital commitment and family life suffer because of the lack of steady, good-paying jobs, the results may be criminal conduct by the next generation, not necessarily by those who are currently employed. And this is an important point to make here, that when all the studies look at unemployment and crime, cross-sectional or longitudinal, they're looking to see, does unemployment cause the individuals who are unemployed to become criminal? But if unemployment has this side effect of changing family life, and this change in family life affects the socialization of children, then we might really want to link the unemployment, the economic circumstances of black men, to crime in the next generation. Several criminologists have looked at the changing rates of married women working outside the home and other indicators of changing family life. Some trends that might be included are increases in one-parent families, especially mother-child families, increases in teenage pregnancies, and youthful mothers. Simon used one of these variables to explain increases in crime by women. Others have used these or related variables to suggest that these changing activities have increased the probability of subtypes of victimization. I see such change, that is a change in family arrangements, I see such changes in lifestyle, living and working arrangements as important indicators of changes in the socialization of children. And by that I simply mean passing on to children the notions of proper conduct, what you do and what you don't do. And some of these trends, by the way, some of the trends that we've talked that are listed above, may explain some forms of delinquency that can be termed physiological. Low birth rates, fetal alcohol syndrome, malnutrition, and other trauma may produce behavioral problems that have a physiological origin at one level. However, this kind of biological explanation is also a social explanation, because it is the social and economic circumstances of the families involved that increase the probability of physiological damage, which may in turn produce some forms of behavioral problems. In suggesting that the major cause of the observed increase in black crime, arrest, and incarceration rates is structural, I'm suggesting that a number of large changes in urban America have produced social and economic conditions that have reduced the possibilities for the kinds of socialization of many black children that reduce the probability of crime. That is, they haven't received the socialization that reduces crime. Among these changes have been increasing urbanization, the movement of large numbers of people to urban areas, large numbers of black people. Well, actually, urbanization includes large numbers of people in general. But this urbanization was accompanied by increased suburban growth and increased segregation by race. It is odd that as the civil rights of the black population have increased, and after official segregation has been eliminated, there should be increased economic and social segregation in the United States. Nevertheless, I believe that this is what's happened, that the urbanization and suburbanization has produced increased segregation. Large numbers of black Americans live in areas where they almost never see a white face. And large numbers of white Americans have moved to other white areas where they, again, are predominantly segregated, or they've moved to the suburbs completely. Now, this is clearly what has happened as all black areas of most cities grew in size and as the white populations of most cities either withdrew to other all-white areas or moved to the suburbs. Increased segregation came when the racial composition of numerous cities changed dramatically in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The situation was made worse by the dislocation of employment possibilities for central city black men with the movement and closing of many industrial plants. In my view, it has been these changes that produced the changes in family arrangements we have seen. That is the urbanization, segregation of the black population in communities where employment opportunities decreased. Now, I should at this point acknowledge the help of a number of students in the 786 seminar, and I'm looking forward to those papers, which will be even more helpful in documenting this fact. The consequences of these changes was not only psychological strain for the adults involved, these changes also created situations where there was less time and money for the care and training of children. I'm suggesting that this isolation or exclusion from stable employment created more unstable and disadvantaged families. Large-scale changes in family life or living arrangements are not bad in themselves. But for poor single-parent families, these changes frequently mean that the kids are on the street and on their own at an early age. Under such circumstances, especially when a large number of children find themselves in the same situation, the socialization process may not only be ineffective, it may be distorted in important ways. I should emphasize that this explanation is not limited to explaining increases in black crime. The situation for a sizable segment of the white population in central cities is similar to that of the black population, and it produces roughly the same results. We saw that the white crime rates in these central cities also increased over this period. The rates are not as high, but they move in the same direction in the central cities examined above. Crime, arrest, and incarceration rates for the urban white population have also increased, although they were never as high as those of the urban black population. Crime control policy. If this theory explains much of the increase in urban crime over the last 30 years, and I'm convinced by the data that I have examined that it does, what kind of crime control policy would reverse the situation? First, I think it suggests that there is no short-term solution. Consequently, we still need programs emphasizing public safety because the current problem was not created in a short period of time, and it will not be turned around in a short period. This is an increase that's come over 20 years. We can't expect it to change overnight. This is why politicians who seem to look to the next election will not be very helpful in reducing crime rates. What is required is the introduction of procedures that will provide meaningful work for large segments of most central city populations. This, in turn, will increase the chances for stable family life, or at least provide unstable families with child care, health care, and educational opportunities. The children don't have to be fully socialized at home if they have exposure to socialization experiences in child care and schools. With any luck, these changes will provide better socialization and reduce the number of street-raised or state-raised children. To the extent that a structural explanation of crime trends is accurate, these changes should moderate, if not reduce, predatory crimes like robbery. Daniel Patrick Moynihan saw this connection between family arrangements, jobs, and what he calls social pathology in the 1960s. In my view, the mistake he made was to focus on the need for strong families rather than the need for jobs. I mean, he had the two handles, and he chose one, I think, mostly for political reasons. So he chose strengthening the family rather than providing jobs. And although he was in the Department of Labor at the time, you would have think he'd drift to the jobs one. But strong families will be rare in a society like ours if there are insufficient or poor-paying jobs. Employment opportunities, access to stable jobs, providing the kinds of wages and benefits that will promote family life are important because they increase the chances for effective early childhood socialization, which is crucial for the reduction of crime rates. Although there are no simple or certain ways to reverse current crime trends, we need to start. Given the extent to which this is an urban problem, I think we need to start in urban areas, and we need to focus on a variety of social and educational services directed at children, especially inner city and central city children. In the long run, jobs for the parents of children are crucial. But we could begin with procedures providing pregnant women with prenatal care and with the development of a tax system that would give poor children health care and a decent education. I see hackles going up over. We could also begin by providing high-quality child care to all children so that we do not leave the task of socialization with poor mothers, some of whom are themselves children. The current approach, the approach of the 70s and 80s has been to ignore family and jobs and to focus on pathology. In the process, the tangle of pathology has gotten worse, crime has increased, and the use of incarceration and other costly responses have reached the point of diminishing returns. I say that because as you lock more people up, the jails fill and you have to let some out. So the sentences get longer, the time served gets shorter. Even without an alternative theory, it is time to acknowledge that the punitively oriented theories and quasi-theories of the 70s and 80s have not worked any better than the treatment-oriented theories of the 50s and 60s. Rather than redouble our efforts in this losing cause, we need an approach that recognizes and takes into account the facts of contemporary crime. I should have explained earlier that I would take questions as we went, but obviously I didn't. so I guess I'll take them now. Actually, comments or questions, because I think, I probably have a comment rather than a question.
3 questions or comments on some of the things that you said. And then
Let's take them one at a time, okay?
The first thing that you said earlier on, is it possible? Let me start with maybe the last first, since that's
whatever
fresh in terms of our memory. On the crime control policy, I'm not sure that any of us, working in this area, would disagree when you talk about the need for child care, the input that our schools can give us, even talking about jobs for parents. But obviously, it's not that simple. To give you an example that you talk about why are black arrest rates increasing, and of course you believe, as I believe, I think if we're looking for a theoretical explanation, it's best explained possibly by a structural explanation. You mentioned something about the change in economy seems to create change in family life and the socialization of children. I couldn't agree more. The problem is that if you look at kind of this changing economy as well as the change in society that we have, it seems to me that one thing, we've moved from an industrial to an informational society. Because of that, what it requires is skilled workers. One of the problems in terms of jobs for parents is that those individuals who are the skilled workers out there who can get these jobs, who compete for these jobs, are what I would call, or quote, the haves as opposed to the have-nots. So one of the problems in terms of the jobs for the parents is the parents aren't qualified for that. And maybe we can develop some programs to give them those qualifications so they can compete for those jobs. The other thing with child care, I couldn't agree more, but the problem with child care, especially in recent years, in this change in economy that we have, is that in essence, a lot of those child care facilities are becoming nothing more than warehouses. So they're not getting what I think that they should be providing to the children. In addition, in terms of the schools, if we look at the schools, especially in the urban areas, you take a graduate out of, for example, Houston Yates, and you take a graduate out of Conroe McCullough, all right, and you try to compare those, which individual, which one of those students is going to be able to compete for those skilled jobs. And basically, I think, what I see is you've got an environment of hopelessness and despair in that inner city, and really life becomes a challenge for survival. So, again, in terms of the crime control policy, although I would put crime control / prevention. Not only do I think about what we need to be doing in terms of controlling crime, I think we really do need to think about some long-term strategies in terms of preventing crime. One other thing that you had mentioned that kind of, I don't know what...
Did you have a question in there somewhere?
Well, no, that's a comment. I think what it's trying to suggest is if you look at this, it's not as simple, I think, as and I don't think you meant it to be simple.
I certainly don't suggest it's simple. I think what we need to do is take a fresh look at what we're doing. I mean, we're in a rut now. We're in a rut that says...
liberals or conservatives disagree on that.
Well, that'll be good. I think that means we'll have some change in approach, because if we both approach it pragmatically and say, look, what we've been doing for 20 years hasn't worked, let's try something different, the question will only be then agreeing on what to try. Now, I think where we differ is, again, in terms of political ideology. There are countries, industrial countries in this world, that are suffering some of the same setbacks we're suffering in terms of changing manufacturing employment, but they have taken a quite different approach to the care and training of children. They took this approach a long time ago, well before we did. So if we get to the point where, if you're talking about child care, now I'm not talking about people dropping the children off at some neighbor's where the woman or person looking after those children hardly has time for any of them. But I'm talking about approaching child care the way we approached public education a century ago. And we're drifting away from that commitment to public education. We now have politicians suggesting that we're going to use test scores to decide which schools get the money, or we're going to develop voucher systems. We're abandoning a commitment to public education as a universal right. When that idea was developed 100 years ago, it was a marvelous tool for social mobility, because it said it doesn't matter how much money you have or don't have, you're entitled to go to a publicly supported school, and you're entitled to get the best education that you can benefit from. That was the system that was in play when I went to school, and it was a miracle. It was my salvation, because the people of the city of Chicago, even during the Depression, continued to put up money for public schools. They put it up for public schools right through junior college, so that I didn't have to worry about where I was going to get the money to go to college. I simply had $10 in a high school diploma, and I was in. Now, what I'm suggesting is that that's what you'd call a universal approach. A universal, approaching education as a universal right. All of us help pay for it because all of us benefit from an educated population. Most of us over 40 probably understand the public school ideology. And I hope that those of you who are under 40 get the picture pretty soon, because what we're doing is not moving toward a universal approach to child care, which would be a quality child care program open to every child regardless of income. It doesn't matter if you could afford better child care, you could still send your child there, and if you couldn't afford any child care at all, you could send your child there. Now, why do I suggest this change in our approach to education? That is expanding education down below the kindergarten. Because it's the best hope for the rest of us. It's the best hope for a society that's not filled with haves and have-nots, and with people whose only recourse, as far as they can see, is to engage in armed robbery to have the things that everybody else seems to have on television. So I think that we need to re-examine what we're doing, and my political ideology tells me that movement toward a universal system of education and universal system of daycare will make the difference. Now, some of you will have different ideas on that, and that's where the debate will come in.
You seem to have eliminated just now those people who do only have the recourse of armed robbery to gain what they need, those who are not as privileged and that are not even semi-as the very bottom tier of our society.
Yeah.
How would you treat them? How would you prevent that?
Well, I think, again, that it's the difference between short-term and long-term. I think in the short run, we're going to need many and most of all the crime control policies that we now have to deal with just simple issues of public safety. I mean, you just can't have people going around committing armed robbery as a way to make a living. But the long-run solution is not a solution that says we can ignore the causes of crime. We don't even have to ask what causes this tremendous increase in robberies over the last 20 years. All we need to do is get tough with criminals. Getting tough with criminals is all right for that segment of those criminals that you catch. It doesn't make any difference, though, to those that you're generating if you continue the same process. If we continue to through the processes I've described, to raise succeeding generations of armed robbers, and they start out fairly young, we're not going to do anything about the armed robbery rate, even though we build and double our institutions. And as we've seen, doubling the institutions is not a probable solution. I think most people, regardless of political ideology, will see the utility in doing something different once they begin to see the cost of institutionalization. And once they realize how much it costs and how much it would cost to double the effort. The construction, not only the construction cost, but just the cost of running those institutions. Let me get somebody else in.
Going back to your first chart, where it's
The
showing the great increase in
incarceration.
Now, how can I say the great increase in arrest, but how many of these people that you study get into the system? I can see how black people are arrested more, but they may only end up at a jail for overnight.
Well,
and how much is where is probation coming in? When I entered this field in the 30s, we used to say the state of Washington, gosh, they put everybody on probation except 10%, and you know, their crime rate's wonderful. We were putting everybody in jail. And so, what is yours? What have you compared?
Yeah, let me in a rough way, and I really need to get better data, and with everybody's help here, I probably will before I leave. But one of the things that the 70 census showed that about 38% of the people in state and federal prisons were classified as black. By 1986, when they did a survey, the PJS did a survey of those prisons, something like 48%, or maybe even 49%, were classified as black. So this increase in offenses, the increase in arrests, is also leading to an increase in incarceration. So that if I'd put an arrow on that chart, you could just put it about halfway up. Half of those people in state and federal prisons are black. And it's been increasing since certainly at least 1960, probably greatly increased from 1925. So the institutions, and those of you who work in institutions probably saw this happening.
A question and observation. Now, how do you account for the comparative lack of increase in crime and arrest during the Great Depression? That's the question. If poverty is an important factor, why wasn't there more crime in the Great Depression?
I'd say because of the family structure.
Yeah.
There's more of a nuclear family than there is now. There's no more. You don't have the extended family.
But I think she's onto something, because during the Great Depression, and I was one of those people who was in effect a victim of the Great Depression. My father was a plasterer, a skilled worker, but as the wobbly song says, how the hell are you going to work when there's no work to do? And he was frequently unemployed. But he didn't have to leave home, and we didn't have to go on ADC, because the New Deal created relief programs that put money directly into those families, so that we had 7, 8 kids in the family. Somebody brought 7 or 8 bottles of milk every day. We could go down and get prunes and cornmeal, and there was a relief effort which didn't treat this problem as being a problem of pathology. It was just that here we have a situation where large numbers of people who would want to be working are unemployed, and the government owes it to those people to take money from the people that are working and have money and provide for them until the thing is over. And of course, the war came along, and we all did well, better than we ever expected.
Now the observation. What about, you talked about 40 years ago when you went to school in Chicago, there was a universal education that was also relatively uniform. I think the education is there, its quality may have deteriorated. You don't have the compulsion on the part of parents sending the children to that school. You have a large number of one-parent families today that don't care whether or not these children go to school.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. I think that's a problem almost everywhere. As you know, my wife works with learning disabled kids in Amherst, Massachusetts, which is hardly an urban area, but we do have a large population, and the youthful population is increasingly non-white, although mostly Cambodian, not black. And one of the most frustrating things for the teachers in that school is the fact that for some families, it's simply not that important to get the kids to school.
Yeah.
That they may come and they may not come. And it's very hard to work with them because you never know when they're there, and if the mother oversleeps or has something else to do, the kid doesn't go to school. So clearly there may have been other changes, but I think in terms of the massive changes, what we have seen are massive changes in family structure, and the black family in particular, so that we've abandoned generally the extended family. We abandoned that in this country a long time ago, and now we're slowly throwing away the nuclear family, so that really everybody's on their own. And this is most marked in black families, where somebody referred to the fathers as being a kind of ornament, and with no particular use. That the family, the children and mother go on without these fathers, but the fathers are somewhere doing something, and it must have some impact on those kids. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could comment on white-collar crime trend. I mean, we always focus on street
Yeah.
crime, but what about white-collar crime?
Yeah, that's a. I wish I'd anticipated that, because it's a question my radical friends keep asking me. They say, why are you always talking about predatory crime? Why don't you talk about white-collar crime? That's probably been increasing as well. It may well be increasing. We just don't have good measures of it. We just don't have very good data on it. And in many ways, the consequences of some types of white-collar crime are really less frightening to people. That is, if somebody's worked out a scheme to steal from me in some tax way, or to defraud the government in some way, or even to defraud me personally by rounding off my bank account and slipping some of that money into their own. If we're talking 25 cents a day or something, it's not the same thing as somebody holding a gun up to my head and demanding my watch and ring, which I can't even get off my finger. I mean, it's a much more frightening thought. So I don't have any apology for focusing on what I call predatory crime, because I see these as fundamental offenses. I mean, these would be crimes even if we recreated society. We would recreate rules that say you do not use a weapon and threat of force to take something from somebody. These rules would be rapidly produced, whereas it might take a while before we got interested in antitrust violations, for example. But I don't know. Why don't you make your comment, because you clearly have something here.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, I know you said at the beginning you can't have a general theory of crime, but if white-collar crimes are increasing, then the way we're socializing just conventional people too, it's not that great. You know what I'm saying? If they're out doing different kinds of crimes, even if they're not as scary.
Yeah.
It does, I don't know.
So that you're saying the socialization process is broken down in general, I really think that we wouldn't. If we focused on that, we might put more white people in prison, but I don't think that would be the solution.
I wanted to take exception with one comment you just made. Undoubtedly, more people die in the United States as a result of unsafe products than all the muggings, all the robberies, all the homicides combined. I mean, muggings that lead to undoubtedly more people die in the United States.
Unsafe products. You mean prescription drugs?
Well, it's not just unsafe products. It's unsafe working conditions, unsafe products. If you look at how many people die as a result of alcohol abuse, how many people die as a result of tobacco tackle. There's no safe way.
Yeah, right. I would extend that, though, to say that there are tremendous numbers of people die in automobile accidents we don't seem to be concerned about. And all of these... No, but I mean, but I'm saying the basic difference in all of these things is that we don't suggest that the people that cause these deaths are acting intentionally. Now, I mean, well, to the extent that they are, then we do need laws that if people are committing homicide by requiring their workers to work with radium as they treat the dials of clocks, knowing that those people are going to die from cancer of the mouth, then they are culpable. But when you talk about people dying from unsafe conditions, from unsafe working conditions, from unsafe products, unless you argue that the people who produce those products or set up those working conditions know and intend for it to kill those people, I think we're talking about a different kind of activity.
It's willful, if there is such a thing, it's willful neglect. And
Well,
when the people at the Ford Motor Company get together and make a statistical analysis that it is
Yeah.
cheaper not to recall the Pinto,
Yeah.
just settle 50 death cases out of court,
Right.
then that's willful,
Yeah.
intentional. And they were prosecuted.
well, they were prosecuted. Unfortunately, they should have been charged probably with manslaughter rather than homicide. They might have been convicted. But the fact is that if you talk about indicting a company, who are you going to lock up anyhow? I mean, it takes a wholly different approach. And I'm not uninterested in white collar crime. I'm just saying that the same kinds of theories that will explain white collar crime and increases in white collar crime are not going to explain predatory crime any more than the same theories are going to explain the increase in various use of various illegal substances.
I don't have any quarrel with that. But I just briefly wanted to mention one other thing is that you said that we're heading more and more into a punitive direction with respect to street crime and not really dealing with the underlying causes. It seems to me the war on drugs is a perfect example of this.
Yeah.
Where we're only going to be, supposedly the war on drugs is going to help the people in the inner cities, but we're only going to spend so much money on people in the inner cities. If we spend it on law enforcement for war on drug purposes, we're just going to take it out of Upward Bound and
Yeah.
all the other drugs.
Yeah, I agree. If somebody were to ask me, and actually somebody did, a television reporter said to me, what would you do to reduce crime? I said, well, in the short run, the first thing I would do to reduce crime would be to stop trying to use the criminal law to keep people from inhaling, ingesting, and otherwise using substances that are defined by some category, some segment of the population as immoral or are sinful. That if we did that, we could certainly reduce the profits available to people providing those products, and we would reduce the warfare that occurs over markets. We would reduce the homicides tremendously. In fact, one chart I didn't put up because I wasn't focusing on homicide, but the homicide trends increased. The last time homicide trends increased anywhere near they are right now was just before 1932 when they decided to make beverage alcohol legal. And up until that point, people were killing each other over the markets. And so, while we know this, I mean, we understand this. It's not something new to us. The experience as a country we've been through before. The history is clear. People have called it to people's attention, and yet we have such a kind of ideological commitment or investment in suggesting that we have to have a war on drugs. And we have to stamp out drugs and zero tolerance for drugs, that we divert enormous police resources to this. 1/5 of the people in the Texas prison system are there only on drug offenses. Now, they may have done something else, but they're only charged with drug offenses. So we could reduce the prison population by 20% at least by simply doing away with these attempts to use the criminal law to do something that it can't do. It's simply incapable of doing it. And this doesn't mean that the use of drugs is a good thing. It just means that the criminal law is a poor tool to control it. And it has these secondary effects of producing violence, which increase the homicide rates and probably the robbery rates. Let me hear from some of the graduate students, another graduate student.
You mentioned universal child care, job training. My question is, how do your proposal differ from CETA, Job Corps, Head Start, and nostalgic trip to
right.
the 60s? And why do you think your proposals now will work where they didn't work in the past?
Well, they're not the same. They're not the same. What we went through in the 60s were programs aimed at certain categories of people, and you had to be qualified for those programs. And special programs focused on specific targets, will always be poor programs. I'm committed to the notion of a universal approach to education because we've seen it work. It's worked in other countries, and we've seen it work here. And it's not the same to say that to have every child have a right to adequate child care is not the same as setting up a child care program for poor mothers, because we've had this before. Wealthy people will put their kids in very good nursery schools. They won't even call it daycare. This is a nursery school. This is to give them some added experience, not just to watch them. Poor mothers will not be able to afford those nursery schools, and their children, if we had some kind of a piecemeal patchwork program as we had in the 60s, their children might be eligible for some Head Start program. But if you had a universal Head Start program that was open to every child, regardless of the income of that child, it'd be a more successful program. I really believe that, and I think the reason we're getting into so much trouble in public education is because we've drifted away from that concept. And we now have what you refer to as the haves, who are unwilling to put up the money to provide a decent education for the have-nots. And I don't think this would be the case, unfortunately, I don't think this would be the case if race were not a factor. It's like the lack of concern for the treatment of juveniles in our juvenile prisons that what was her name, Blomquist talked about. The fact is, if we thought that those kids were our kids, or even kids that we might know or like, we would be very concerned what was happening to those kids. But since the vast majority of those kids are poor, most of them black, many Hispanic, the haves in this country don't care what happens to them. You can't get their attention. You can't get them to worry about that.
I respectfully disagree with that. Roland, I've dealt with a lot in terms of political ideology. We may not always agree on some things. I agree with a lot of what you said today, but to suggest that, for example, the Reagan-Bush administration or the haves, that somehow that we're racist, that we don't care about the juvenile delinquency problem in this country because most of them happen to be black. There may be some of those, but to suggest that I think if what you just said is a generalized statement with regard to haves, I would respectfully disagree.
Well, I would expect that. But no, what I'm saying is that maybe we're not in this situation yet, but we may be drifting to it rather quickly, because we could get to the point where a majority of people are sufficiently comfortable that they will vote in election after election for the people that promise to reduce their taxes. And one of the things that we know we're not going to do much about the institutionalized population, we're not going to do much about education, we're not going to do much about child care, we're not going to do much about health care if we continue to reduce the tax base. That without public monies, these things won't happen. And I think I don't know that it's racially motivated. I just think that people would pay more attention if they thought that it was their kids or kids like their kids who were exposed to these facilities. They'd be much more likely to be concerned about and react to conditions in those institutions. Let me get another.
How much of this, instead of being a black-white issue, is actually a socioeconomic issue on who is in the lower?
I think it's essentially. I think it's essentially a social class issue, and in one way, I'm using social class as a proxy. I mean, using race as a proxy for social class. But it's more than just a social class issue, because it's social class compounded by race. And well, there were people that were quite willing not only to give money, but to come into the city to help me as a poor white kid. And I don't see those people going in and establishing settlement houses and working with kids in those black communities, even in the old neighborhoods where I grew up. I don't think somehow the same thing is happening, and I think it's because it is a social class issue, but it's also compounded by race. It's made more difficult by race. It isn't, by the way, a one-way situation. The isolation that I'm talking about came about in a number of ways, but I think is a very unfortunate development following the civil rights movement, there was the Black Power movement and the Black separatist movement. And I think the division of our society in some ways has gotten worse as a result of not only white indifference to blacks, and certainly the white retreat from where black people are, but also because of the philosophy and development in many black communities of hostility toward whites. I think we have to come together on this issue, but I don't think we're going to do it in the present climate.
One more question. Give me time to grip the table before you answer. How do you suppose to pay for this? That's not a rhetorical question.
No, to pay for it, yeah.
Where are we going to get the expenditure?
We're going to do it by raising taxes. You see, one of the things, one of the most devastating developments of the 80s. One of the most devastating developments for this society, one of the things that may send us backward for the next 10 years, has been the suggestion that somehow we're overtaxed as a society. Somehow that I'm overtaxed, that middle-class people are overtaxed. And so we have politicians who get elected saying, read my lips, no new taxes. The same politicians simply can't bring themselves to say, we need money to improve education. Now we're going to see today revealed a new education plan of the education president. I'll bet he's not willing to put 25 cents into that program. He might have some small funds available for exemplary programs. But until we say the way in which we fund public education is with public funds through taxes, and until we make the link for people between taxes and services, and people see the need to pay taxes, until we move away from the current political rhetoric, fashionable political rhetoric, very, very effective political rhetoric, until we move away from that, we're in a disastrous state in this country. People won't even put up money to build prisons, which I don't see as a positive development. But I would think that they would at least put up money for that. They say, well, we want to lock these people up, then we'll raise our taxes. But we don't even have politicians suggesting that.
Hasn't that been 200 years of rhetoric, though, Roland?
No, it hasn't been as bad. It's never been as bad as it is currently, as far as I can see. Never been as bad. There's always been some uneasiness with tax and unfairness of taxes.
I'm overtaxed. I hate the post office. No,
well, but the general, in a general way in this country, people have always been willing to pay taxes if they saw them as fair and they saw the services worthwhile. What's happened, I think, in the last 20 years is we somehow, people have lost touch with the link between taxes and services. And so many politicians have played on this that you can't even get a good debate on the issue. You can't even get a good discussion.
You and I would disagree. If, for example, I would agree that I'd like to see state tax and taxes, but if you really look at it, and Roland and I would agree, it's going to get worse. And I think the reason it's going to get worse is one of the trends that I talk about when I do seminars is the aging of America. The older one gets, the more conservative one becomes, and he or she doesn't want to spend any of their money towards taxes. No. And until we can change that, and I'm not really sure how we're going to change that, but really the aging of society doesn't portend good things for us in terms of the future.
I think you're right. I agree with you on that. And I think one of the things that we see when you look at the per capita incomes available to children, the per capita income available to old people, I'm growing old at a very good time. Because per capita income for old people has been increasing steadily in the last 15 years. Per capita income for children has been decreasing. I don't think, though, that Americans are uneducable. I'm just looking for somebody to exercise some political leadership and suggest that this simplistic approach of no new taxes is simply not working, and we have to convince older people that the kinds of programs that have made their lives, their elderly lives secure, should be available for young people, and that in the long run, that's the future. That's the future of the society. I want to hear from some of those graduate students.
Is it wholly fair to compare the legalization of drugs with the repeal of the 18th Amendment? When the 18th Amendment was enacted, the Volstead Act, which implemented it, deprived a large part of our population of something that was a part of their cultural heritage, drinking.
Yeah.
Drugs are not part of anybody's cultural heritage.
Well, it depends on your culture. And the similarities are these. that there is simply a lack of consensus, a lack of agreement. The thing that brought about the Volstead Act was a basically rural Protestant population that didn't believe in drinking, that got enough of their legislators to make it illegal to manufacture and sell the stuff. Because of rum and Romanism and all that. So it was a symbolic crusade that as Gusfield has said, that made it possible for a group of people who were falling behind in terms of numbers in the country to exert some influence. But it reflected a split in the population. It reflected a lack of consensus. There was just no agreement as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. What we have in the area of drugs is the same type of lack of consensus. And so in that sense, they're similar. They're different in a variety of ways, but I think the consequences of this, having a law that's essentially unenforceable, largely because of a lack of consensus on it, this kinds of laws increase the profitability of providing the substance, and there's no recourse to law to settle disputes. This leads to the kinds of homicide that we've seen, homicidal increases. I really do think that it's probably one of the reasons I didn't take homicide is because homicide is a little different from some of these other offenses, and the way to reduce those homicides, I think, a large number of those homicides, is to simply stop trying to use the criminal law to do this. This would, in the process, free an enormous amount of police resources to deal with real predatory crime. And I don't really regard drugs as a predatory crime. It's a self-inflicted wound, as far as I can see.
What are we going to do with the programs that already exist? All these social
Which ones?
That already
The AFDC? Scrap it. Scrap it. AFDC has been a disaster.
Public health systems that we have.
Well, you could, if you really want to start over, get rid of all of these. We go back to the notion of some type of income maintenance program.
Why not start over with the education system as well?
Well, that isn't going to do the same thing as providing people with. How far are we going to go?
Yes, sir.
Well, we're going to go as far as we can in a society where there's always been debate and discussion as to what the future should be. I think without making the effort to come up with some new approach, I don't think anything's going to happen. We'll continue to drift the way we have, and I really do see, looking at these data, I do see if we do what we've been doing for another decade, we will have probably more than half of our prisons filled with young black people, and we will probably need twice as many prisons. And we will still have some of the highest predatory crime rates imaginable. So I don't see us getting anywhere by continuing to do what we're doing. I think it's time to start to do something else as we move into the next century. Yeah.
What will, if we get rid of these programs that you say we should scrap, what is going to be the response of the customers of that program? How are you going to convince them that yes, you will have something that is bigger and better there, and will it be bigger and better?
Well, it will. I mean, it's like worrying about changing our health system so that we really have universal health care as a right. All we have to do is look to Canada, and they've provided a system that works a hell of a lot better than ours, is on the average cheaper than ours. It's the same thing with assistance. They have a child allowance program there. Certainly it's pronatal to a certain extent, but you can probably combine education to convince people not to have more children simply because you get a certain amount of money for each child. But it's certainly better than our AFDC program because it doesn't require that the father be absent, for one thing. Now, even
Dr. Strecker would have had to wait 6 months for his new hip under the Canadian system, where today he walks in and says, here's my $4,000 and I do it in 5 days.
it's good for him, but there are lots of people that don't have $4,000 who aren't walking at all. So, I mean, it's really is a matter of political ideology. It's the kind of society you want to live in. It's the kind of you want to live in a place where people that don't have any money die and people that have money get the best health care in the world. Then we continue to do what we're doing. If you want to live in a society where, as long as you stay up above the ground and in high-rise buildings and leave at 5 o'clock and have adequate television security, you're safe. But if you walk around the street in the same streets in the same city from 10 to 12, you're a target. And you want to live in a society like that, let's keep on doing what we're doing, because that's what we're going to have. Yep.
You mentioned several times on with prisons, building more prisons. Building more prisons to me, doesn't seem to solve anything. If anything, it perpetuates the problem. That doesn't. It also doesn't seem to fit with your other.
No, I'm sorry. I misled you. I'm not actually in favor of building more prisons. I think it's a tremendous waste. But I do think that it's interesting that people who argue for locking more people up are still unwilling to pay in taxes what it costs to lock them up. I think it's ironical. The only reason we don't have more people locked up and don't have more prisons is because people aren't willing to pay for them, not because they wouldn't like to see more people locked up. I mean, it's an odd kind of thing, but I think it's a tremendous waste. I think when you ask how would we pay for this, I think there are other sources of public funds that are essentially untapped. We came very, very close to having a peace dividend, to reducing the tremendous amounts of money we spend for war, national defense, and preparation for war, and payment for past wars, and much of that money is totally unnecessary. And until Mr. Bush got this war going in Iraq, with some help from Saddam Hussein, then we were just very close to converting some of that money to other uses, to more productive uses. Because after all, most of that money is not. And I was in the military. I mean, I spent time training to train, getting ready to get ready. I mean, it's a very unproductive activity. Unless there's a war, in which case you're underpaid. When there's no war, it's a tremendous waste of money. And so I think there are other ways that we could make changes. One of those would be to stop putting money in prisons and to stop putting money to build up a weapons system that we will probably, hopefully, never need.
But what are we going to do with A, the prisons we already have, B, the people that are already in prisons, and the people that do need something done with them? We can't just. We have to have some sort of measure.
Well, I should get some help on this score from experts in this, but I suspect that if we have those prisons, they will be full, right?
Exactly.
There's just no.
Well, we shouldn't. But what are we going to do instead? That's what I mean. I realize that you don't have all the answers, but it's easy to come up with all these things. That we need more taxes, we do all these things, but.
Well, I think, again, to go back to my basic theme is that what's been lacking and what we've been losing are central city employment opportunities. It's really it was almost a cruel joke, but unfortunate development that happened between 60 and 80. About the time that the black population got themselves urbanized, got to where the jobs were, the Titanic went down with them aboard. So we're in a very bad situation. I don't know how we're going to create new jobs, but I'm not sure that it isn't a chicken and egg issue. It's how you prepare people to be ready for jobs or have jobs that are ready for people. But I am convinced that development has produced the higher crime rates we're observing, and it has the potential of producing even higher crime rates. Yeah.
One last question again.
Do you think that an aggressive educational policy, I don't know what Bush is going to come up with in the next few months, days, years, but do you think an aggressive educational policy, possibly one that would lengthen school days, lengthen school years, or community-wide? I think Dallas is talking about a curfew time limit for school-aged children. Do you think these are going to affect the target population?
Yeah, I think they would. I think what we have is we have a school system, a school calendar designed for an agricultural population. The only reason we let kids out all summer is because they had to help on the farm. But there are no farms for these kids to work on, and what they lose in time over that long period of time is tremendous. Now, this is why I say it's structural or institutional. These are long-standing procedures we have, very difficult to change, very slow to change. People believe this is the way you ought to do it. But clearly, changing the school year, the school system, and why we say children are only eligible to be treated to be exposed to public education when they're 5 years old. Well, maybe what we have to do is extend the activities of schools, not with the same people, not putting more burden on the same teachers, but extend the activities that we define as public school down to a much earlier age, so that kids, in effect, get Head Start programs. That every kid gets a Head Start program. Yeah, I think it'll take those kinds of institutional changes, and those changes will cause money and cause some consternation. But you got to start somewhere, I think.
Well,
you said one last
Yeah.
question, one last comment.
One last comment. Here we go. Here we go.
Let me mention a comment. Roland, first of all, I wish we could have more discussions like this. I think it's good for both faculty and students. And the only other thing is you would ask for why the victimization data different from the robbery and the rest of it. I just might offer, at least from my experience, would you agree or not agree that maybe it's due to the underreporting, for example, the embarrassment with regard to rape victims, the lack of confidence in the system with regard to many of the residents of the inner city, and maybe even to the lack of emphasis on victimization, because victimization really is just a phenomenon that I think we spend a lot of time on just for the 80s. So I just offer those.
Yeah, let me just comment on the underreporting. When you're talking about underreporting and victimization surveys, you're saying that the people will call the police and report that they've been a victim of robbery or an attempted robbery, but that when I come to the door and ask them, has anybody ever tried to take something from the use of force, they'd be embarrassed to tell me?
Well,
I just don't see it happening on a large scale. I don't think it's going to be just underreporting, or certainly not from embarrassment.
I don't think it's an embarrassment for the example you gave. It may be an embarrassment, for example, the rape victim.
Yeah, well, I purposely avoided rape here.
Okay.
Thank you for your...
Things. I think Dr. Chilton deserves a lot of applause for this thoughtful presentation. Secondly, I'd like to briefly introduce, especially for the new doctoral students, Dr. Roland here, who was the first director and dean of the Criminal Justice Center, 60 or 70,